Welcome to Beyond the Bee, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy. My guests today are Steve Sharer and Garrett Miller. Steve is the CEO and co-founder of RipRap Security. Before keeping nonprofits and B Corp secure from cyber attacks at RipRap, he helped protect public sector institutions and technology companies focused on development, security, and operations. Understanding that many nonprofits operate with lean teams and a wide array of technologies, Steve supports organizations in implementing their security as they grow and mature. He helps implement the right security measure for each stage of development, keeping organizations, staff, data, and the communities they serve safe without overwhelming limited resources or disrupting their mission-focused work. And Garrett is also the co-founder and technical lead of RipRap Security, and he's a self-described hacker for good. And one of his core beliefs is that usability and security don't have to be at odds. Steve and Garrett, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for being on. And I'll just give some context for listeners because we haven't done any cybersecurity podcasts on this channel. So for folks who are curious, like, why are we doing this? So I invited Steve and Garrett on the show because a lot of purpose-driven orgs like B Corps and nonprofits and mission-driven companies underestimate cyber risk. The biggest gaps are usually basic, preventable misconfigurations. And Steve and Garrett help nonprofits and B Corps with practical, stage-appropriate security without jargon and without derailing the mission. So we'll cover the real risks, quick wins you can do today, and why security is core to working in next economy organizations. Steve, maybe I'll start with you. Can you tell us a bit about your background and how you first got into the work you're doing today?
Sure. Yeah. Garrett and I actually went to university together. We were in a program that focused on cybersecurity and kind of in this pro-government or working with the government to improve national security. And after college, I went to work for the National Security Agency. And there I worked as a hacker and an analyst to uncover cyber attacks against the US and its allies to help counter some of the biggest threats that were out there at the time. When I left government and I went into industry, working for consulting companies and banks and automakers, but I missed the mission-oriented work that I had been doing in the government, and I wasn't ready to go back into the government. And so Garrett and I put our heads together. We said, okay, who can we help that's not the government, that is mission-driven, so we could feel really good about the impact that we're having out there. And we got on the track of supporting nonprofits and B Corps and other purpose-driven organizations.
Awesome. And which year did RipRap get started?
In 2020.
2020. Okay. And Garrett, what about you? Did you think I'm going to be hacking for good when you were young? Or was this evolved for you?
I think it's kind of a fairly common story, but, ever since I was a little kid, I was just kind of drawn to anything technical. My mom tells me she used to have to hang a towel over the old, home phone that we used to have. So I wasn't just constantly like playing with it and pressing buttons and, making long distance phone calls to Kenya. But I was always interested in taking things apart, seeing how they worked, seeing what else you could do with them, things the designers might not have had in mind, which is kind of like what the essence of hacking is, I think. But what this means is that I identified kind of early on that like computing and computer security was a career path that I wanted to follow, but I didn't just want to write code for a living. That eventually led me to much like Steve, a really cool career opportunity with the US government, but I'd probably have to get some additional approvals to go into a little more detail than this. But I got to hone my technical skill set there, travel the world, got to do some really cool stuff. And I did eventually get out of that line of work after, a little over a decade or so. Spent some time at some commercial companies here in the Bay Area to learn how things are done there. But one of the things, like Steve was saying, that I missed about my time in government was that mission focus. And that is what eventually led Steve and I to start RipRap Security. We think of it as this company that is focused on serving those that serve others. And my hope with that is to kind of bring that mission focus on my government work, but that kind of like big tech, cybersecurity, engineering expertise, and make that accessible to these next economy type companies.
Awesome. Just out of curiosity, what is if you were to go into some of the more things you did, like what does the US government require from like, oh, if you're going to talk about work you did for the government, you have to do X. Like, how does that even work?
Sure. It's a provision of holding a security clearance that generally, anytime you speak on a topic that touches closely enough on work you did in that classified environment, you have to seek pre-publication approvals before you start to talk about that kind of work. So again, unfortunately for that reason, won't be able to go into a great amount of detail about the type of work that I did there, but it was cybersecurity aligned and, focused on protecting the US and its allies.
Yeah. Wild. And you still have a security clearance? Is that what you said?
It might exist on paper somewhere, but it hasn't been active in some years.
Fair enough. Okay. So Steve, maybe for you, why should purpose-driven businesses, B Corps, nonprofits care about cybersecurity? Maybe actually, can we just define cybersecurity for folks? Like, what are we actually talking about? And then maybe go into like, why should they care about that?
Yeah, great question. Cybersecurity, from our perspective, is making sure that the way that you're using technology is safe from getting disrupted. And so that disruption could mean that an attacker is able to lock out all the files on your computer through a ransomware attack, or they can hack an employee's email account and use it to try to cause the company to pay for a fraudulent invoice that the attacker sends. And so we think about cybersecurity as traditional bits and bytes, but as the nature of work has changed over the last decade or so, and the threats have changed, we think about security from protecting the organization and its staff. More and more ever these days, it's very important that we focus on the staff safety and security, the security of its data, and then the security of the organizations and the people that the organizations serve, and protecting that.
So why, for like purpose-driven companies, should they care about cybersecurity?
I think the main reason to care is that most purpose-driven organizations are working with sensitive communities, right? Whether it's a sensitive immigrant community, LGBTQ plus community, or even a local community that you're serving just more generally in a geographic area. It's about being a strong steward of their data and of their interests and really protecting it. We often find organizations, they tell me things like, why would an attacker care about us, right? Like, we're so small. Why would they care? And that honestly is precisely why an attacker cares. It's because tends to be that prevailing attitude. Attackers know that smaller organizations, nonprofits, organizations that are more resource constrained are easier to attack and easier to steal money from or cause harm to.
Yeah, I know that, for example, if you're Tesla or Google or IBM, you have like a huge team of security, your security team, but it's like the small to medium companies which can't afford like an in-house security team that attackers want to target, right, around, because it's like an easier target.
There usually is one employee who wears like 15 or 20 different hats. One of them is IT and another is security, and they spend as much time as they can on it, but they have other work to do.
And Garrett, maybe could you speak about the risk today? Like, what's the sort of threat landscape? Like, what's actually happening out there? What are you seeing with some of the clients you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. If you would have asked me this question a year or two ago, I would have said the primary threats that we're seeing facing these purpose-driven organizations are your kind of typical, like, run-of-the-mill hackers, cybercrime organizations, people mainly looking to extract funds from organizations. And that was kind of the primary threat model we were seeing for these organizations a couple of years ago. We have seen an uptick in recent years of both government-based threats against these organizations and also ideologically driven attacks. So depending on your mission area, depending on what line of business you're in, depending on if you are one of these nonprofits or purpose-driven organizations, depending on who you're serving, depending on who you're working with, there may be people out there who don't like that you're in that line of work or don't like that you're working with that type of community. So we have seen an uptick in both organizations that are concerned about those ideologically driven attacks and wanting to know what they can do to better defend themselves. And then we have also seen an uptick in organizations that are coming to us being like, hey, we are increasingly concerned about both legal governmental threats against our data and the types of organizations that we work with, and also cybersecurity threats posed by those same government institutions.
So it's not only just the I don't know. You can tell me if this is actually a real thing, but like the teenager in like Macedonia who like does a ransom, like downloads a software as a service, like ransomware type thing and just sends it out to, is that maybe the threat landscape a couple years ago, but now it's, those people still exist, but also governments are getting more involved.
Yeah, and that certainly does still exist. Yeah, and you know, governments have been involved in hacking and spying for decades now, but I think given some of the things that are going on right now, I think there's a renewed focus on not just, you know, perhaps foreign governments spying on you, but just being aware of what data you have that might be of interest to your own government as well.
And Steve, on that line of thinking, do you see attacks that seem politically or ideologically motivated, like targeting nonprofit workers or like nonprofits working on climate, human rights, or social justice?
Yeah, we're seeing an incredible number more threats against these kinds of more progressive organizations than ever before. You know, we have the political pressures put on them by federal and state government officials, special interest groups, and then essentially an ever increasing number of empowered sort of extremists that are taking vigilante approaches to targeting organizations. We field a lot of calls about and give advice to organizations that are really just concerned about the physical well-being of an organization. I mean, it's certainly one thing to experience a cyber attack or have your accounts hacked or something and money stolen, but it's a whole other thing, several steps beyond, to have your physical person targeted in an attack through doxing or some of these other intimidation techniques and tactics that are used by extremists these days.
Can you tell a little bit more about like what is doxing for folks, and then maybe a couple of the other like physical threats people might be facing?
Yeah, so doxing is essentially a type of attack where a bad guy will go and learn as much about a target, a person, or an organization as they can and publish information that's sensitive about that person. So that could be their address, their family members, their social media accounts, their emails, phone numbers, and what typically results is a huge amount of harassment through essentially all of those channels: phone calls, death threats, bomb threats, calling the SWAT team to the house, swatting. Like, a lot of things happen from what is a relatively easy set of things to do when you're dealing with a doxing attack.
And Garrett, for you, how should like smaller values-driven organizations think about risk if they're working in a space that might ruffle political feathers?
Yeah, the first thing that we advise any sort of organization like that to do is to start with a process called threat modeling, which is kind of just a fancy word for just thinking about in a structured way what you have that you want to protect, who your adversaries might be, what they might want to do to you, what they might want to take from you, what measures you can take to protect yourself against those threats, and then also what you are willing to do to protect yourselves against those threats. You know, one of my core beliefs, as you mentioned at the beginning of this episode, was that I believe that usability and security don't have to be at odds. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes there are some trade-offs when you are facing certain types of advanced threats. And then finally, consider who your allies might be in these fights. You're not out there on your own. There are other like-minded organizations that are fighting a very similar fight as you. So think about the resources that might be available to you and the allies that might be able to help you on this way. But just taking stock of the situation before you start taking action is generally a good first step and is going to lead to better outcomes than, just implementing cybersecurity measures without any sort of plan or thinking about what that might affect or what you're actually protecting against.
Yeah, it reminds me, this is kind of a weird analogy, but for a lot of B Corps, we're going to be required to do stakeholder mapping, which is more like customers, employees, community, environment, political, or suppliers. And it almost is like a little bit of threat modeling in a way. It's like, okay, so who are the sort of folks in this space that might want the data we have or target us? So for listeners, part of the way that I had a connection to RipRap was my wife works for a nonprofit immigration agency that hired RipRap to do a threat assessment and security analysis. And I'm curious, how do listeners think about some of this stuff? And maybe what are some of the, like, for example, if I'm doing a threat modeling, like I actually have no idea who might be the people that might want my data, but there's probably some, like for an immigration firm, might be like ICE, like what do you do if there's actual like a US government branch that might want your data. Like that's, I don't know, Garrett, what comes up for you around that? How do you think about that?
For me, the first thing I would say is, so it sounds like in this case, you already have an idea of who one of the threat actors that might be interested in the data that you hold is. And then when we think about the steps we want to take to start to secure our systems and what data we hold on to, we should keep that in mind. One of the things that Steve and I always say is data that you don't have can't be stolen. So what you might do is you might start to think about the types of data that you're holding on to if you're working with a vulnerable population such as that. And if you have good data hygiene practices in place, you're minimizing the amount of data you actually have to collect to execute your mission. You have standard processes and procedures for aging off that data once it's no longer needed or no longer useful to you. You're reducing your risk exposure by reducing the amount of data that could be either stolen from you in some sort of cyber attack or taken from you as part of some sort of court order or legal action. So again, taking inventory of what you have and maybe minimizing those holdings might be the first step you might take.
Well, it's really smart. I think for our company, now I'm shifting to I think we just have everything on Google Drive, right? Let's just like years of history. But you're right. Like, do we even need probably 50% of that data or more is just completely expired, sitting on the hard drive.
Yeah, and a lot of services like Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace have features in there that will allow you to set rules like data that is more than 4 years old, 5 years old automatically gets aged off. We know a lot of organizations are hesitant to put stuff like that in place because Murphy's Law says you set a 5-year data retention policy, and on 5 years plus 1 day, you're going to need that email from 5 years ago or that document from 5 years ago. In practice, we find most often that's not the case, but it does make people nervous.
Steve, you want to jump in?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're spending more time than ever with organizations helping them to put these data retention policies in place where the data gets automatically deleted. And the challenge we pose to them on the first day in the first meeting is like, what's the shortest amount of time that you can stand to not have emails for? And the lowest we've gotten is about 6 months so far with our customers.
Wow, that's pretty good.
It's pretty good. Yeah. I mean, they were really aggressive about it, and it served them well when they were targeted down the line, is that, they hardly had any data to provide as part of a legal request that they experienced. And so them already having that in place really reduced the risk of the types of exposure that they could have faced otherwise with the data.
Yeah, and I want to just add one more thing to that.
Yeah.
Is this has to be a proactive process that you put in place before you become aware of some sort of specific, especially legal threat to your organization. So
yeah, you can't just start deleting data.
You can't start deleting data once you find out that someone's interested in it. So I have to caveat this by saying I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. But generally speaking, my understanding of the law is that once you receive a subpoena or some sort of court order to preserve or provide digital data as part of legal proceedings, you cannot at that point go start deleting data. You cannot at that point go start encrypting your data. But if you already had a routine process in place, like, we don't keep anything longer than 6 months, or we already encrypt all of our hard drives, you're going to be a lot safer in that scenario. Whereas in the other scenario, that could potentially be construed as destruction of evidence and things like that. Well,
we may be on to like some of these early recommendations, Steve. So if we're saying data retention, and it sounds like the recommendation on this is just what's the shortest amount of time you can tolerate. And I guess a follow-up question for that would be like, what if, I'm just thinking of my company, we might say like, okay, we probably need at least 2 years, just using a number. Does that mean like literally you cannot get the data if you needed it later? like it's really gone? It's not just like archived?
Yeah, it's really gone unless you provide or unless you set up a sort of archive service. Yeah. There are ways to customize it so that certain email folders have these rules and certain Google Drive folders have these rules of different, we're going to keep files older than 7 years or not. So you can get pretty fine grained with it, but it's important to know like you're not getting it back once it's gone.
Yeah. Okay. And then what's another one of your sort of top things that you might turn to?
Yeah, I think the thing that we wish all organizations did was to mandate what we call multi-factor authentication. And so what this typically looks like is you have a username and a password for Google Workspace or Microsoft or Slack or whatever. And then you have a third factor, which can be a code that you get on your cell phone or the Touch ID on your iPhone or your Mac. And we basically, if all the organizations that we've worked incidents on in the last 5 years had this, mandated, they just wouldn't have had these incidents. Like almost every org we've helped after an attack and during an attack hasn't spent the time to mandate it. It is a 45-second change to make in the settings. It's all it takes to put in place. It takes some weeks ahead of time to make sure everybody's on board and that no one gets locked out of their accounts. But it is the number one cheapest way to protect your organization. And we just wish more people would take advantage of it. It's not as hard or as painful as it used to be. They've made it really easy in many cases with the more modern multi-factor methods to just get it set up. And most people are already using these for their bank and maybe social media, but you have to mandate it in the tools where you can, which is possible for productivity suites like Google Workspace or Microsoft 365.
Garrett, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Just piggybacking on what Steve said, literally, 90+% of the cyber attacks that we see and we respond to would be prevented if organizations just turned on that multi-factor authentication. So that is a huge step you can take, and it is in almost all cases free to turn on. The first thing that I would tell organizations to start with, though, is just to take an inventory and audit your organization's hardware, software, and data. So that means, physical computers that are inside your office. That means software as a service subscriptions that you have on the internet. That means user accounts that you have in your organization's primary productivity suite, so Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace. Just knowing what you have and knowing what's in use is the first step to protecting it. You cannot effectively protect that which you don't know you have. We see this with a lot of organizations we work with where there are either services running on the internet that they've forgotten about, so they're just sitting out there with data in them, and that could potentially be a point of compromise that could leak data from the organization. And we also see a lot of cases where organizations continue to maintain active accounts for employees long after they've departed the organization. I think we've worked with an organization that still had an active account for an employee that departed 6+ years ago. And what that means is not only that is a potential entry point for an attacker, that account just sitting there and being active, and it probably has never had a password update, it probably has never had multi-factor authentication applied to it, but they're also paying the licensing costs for that account for this entire time. So it's not just good cybersecurity sense, it's good financial sense as well to take inventory of everything that you have that you're paying for and reduce your attack surface area is the term that we use, by just reducing those accounts, reducing those services that are no longer in use. And then once you know what you have, it's a lot easier for either your organization to protect what you have or to bring in a partner and you're able to say, hey, here's what we have, here's what we need protected. And it'll make those conversations go a lot more smoothly.
We've saved organizations like literally tens of thousands of dollars just by reviewing their lists of who has what accounts and helping them trim that down. I did an assessment the other day and they had a Google Workspace account that was last used and last logged into in 2010.
Wow.
Right. So like that's
like $15 a month, right?
Yeah. It's $15 a month.
15 years.
Right. Like that's that person, if that account was a person, that person would be learning to drive, with their learner's permit. Like that's old. So yeah, it's one of the better security, operational and sort of money saving 2-first, 3-first that we help organizations with pretty regularly.
Yeah. Because if someone has an old user, an attacker could basically find a way to get into that account, but then they have access to all of your documents and they can move laterally through your systems. And you'd actually laugh. A couple of years ago, I changed this because I was like, this is too ridiculous. But we had a shared Google sheet amongst our team that had all of our passwords for everything.
Oh no.
And our social security number. We're like, hey, let's make this accessible to everybody. And I was like, okay, guys, I think this is not a good security practice.
Yeah, that's a holy grail for an attacker.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had one customer, they had one of these spreadsheets. They call it affectionately the spreadsheet of doom. If it was compromised by an attacker, it has, 100 or more sites that they have shared logins for. And for those customers, it's hard to change the habit and the dependence on a spreadsheet like that. But moving those passwords to a tool called a password manager is really helpful, both to maintain the ability to share and collaborate in these accounts, and also just to make sure that these accounts remain secure across their lifespan.
Yeah, we switched to, I think, Bitwarden, one of those, and then so now all of our passwords, and I think, I've tried to make it clear to our team, please don't reuse passwords, and the password managers make it pretty easy. Mm-hmm. But do you think just going to a password manager, what are some best practices even within that choice? Because I feel like there's password managers that are not as good as others or things like that?
Yeah, I think the choice of the tool is really important, but the process by which you roll it out is even more important, right? Is how do you change people's habits to use it? How do you make sure that there's adoption of this tool? We meet a lot of organizations that tell me they roll out a password manager. They rolled it out last year and everybody loves it. Everybody's using it. But for many of these, you can check the usage metrics for them and understand your organization's password security and password health. And we often find that the actual adoption of these tools is typically lower than 30%. And so it really matters like how you get people bought into it. How can you make it easy for them to use this tool and follow this practice? Garrett, do you want to talk a little bit about some considerations?
Yeah, the most important thing is just that, you are making a password manager of some type available to your staff, and that you are training people to just let the password manager automatically create you a strong password, not to reuse passwords in multiple places, and then, again, to use that password manager. And password managers, pretty good ones, even come built into most modern web browsers now. Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, Microsoft Edge all have built-in password managers that are pretty secure. They use it's a little technical, but the system's key store to encrypt those passwords on disk. So it's a lot more secure and harder for an attacker to compromise than that, passwords.txt file that's sitting in your desktop or in your Google Drive. But there are some password managers out there that offer some advanced features like sharing of passwords. We generally recommend against account sharing if at all possible, but sometimes there are cases where it is just unavoidable for an organization. And in that situation...
Meaning there's one login for...
Yeah. This happens a lot with social media accounts, banking or financial accounts for an organization. Sometimes it's just not feasible to have individual user accounts per user. That's always better when you can do it. But if you have to share passwords with other people in your organization, we recommend using a password manager tool that allows you to do this securely. We're not being paid to endorse any of these tools, but 1Password is an example of one of these password managers that has this sharing feature built in. And then you can also audit the use of those passwords. So if Steve and I, for example, were to share a login to the RipRap Security banking account, and we're both using 1Password to share that login, first of all, that's going to be the most secure way to share that password. We're not emailing it to each other. We're not texting it to each other. It's stored in this password manager that uses this really secure zero-knowledge architecture. But then let's say something terrible happened. Let's say $100,000 got stolen from RipRap Security's bank account through the online portal, and we have to try to either work with law enforcement or be able to tell the story of what happened. A tool like 1Password, where you can share information about who accessed a password and when, is going to give us that audit trail that we're going to need to determine, okay, it looks like Steve's account last accessed this password on this date, Garrett's account last accessed this password on this date, and the incident happened on this date, so maybe Garrett's computer got compromised and then the attacker was able to, it makes it easier to tell that story when you have those audit logs available to you. And unfortunately, that is also a part of cybersecurity, is not just defending yourself from disruption or something bad happening to you, but it's being able to detect, respond, and recover after something bad has already happened, and be able to tell the story of what happened so you can prevent it from happening again.
And what's your view on Bitwarden?
Bitwarden's a great product. Bitwarden is a great product.
Yeah, I don't know if I can actually access the history of my team using it. Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't know off the top of my head, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'll
have to check into that.
But that's a good test for me as IT lead for my 7-person team. I need to figure out who's using the actual password manager. Okay, so we've got a threat assessment. Is that the name of the first one? It was just, not a threat assessment. You're assessing the technology that you already have and doing an analysis, right? That's kind of like step one.
Yeah, we kind of call that an inventory. Take an inventory of your software, hardware, and services and accounts.
Okay. So we've got that. We've got reduce your data to the level that's most tolerable by the organization. And then, potentially multi-factor, definitely do multi-factor authorization. On that one, my team, some people don't even know that they don't have it. It's not like they're against it. They're just they're like, oh, I have it on my personal, but I didn't know I didn't have it on my work. So I just, within the Google admin portal, I just made it, I just forced it for everybody. It did lock one person out the next day, but then we figured it out. So that's 1Password manager. What else, Garrett? What do you think?
Another thing that we would recommend is go in and check the configuration of these software services that you're using. Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace, they're both great platforms. They have great features. They have great, strong identity controls, good multi-factor authentication features. But in their default configuration, the settings aren't configured in a super secure way. It makes it kind of easy to overshare information. It makes it a little bit harder to have the level of control over your organization's information that you would want to have. So we would recommend going into those admin consoles and tightening the permissions and tightening the settings to make sure they're configured a little bit more securely than the default.
And I think what's nice is many of these tools have started adding like security health check centers.
Mm-hmm.
And you're probably seeing these in things like in like a private Gmail account as well, or on Facebook, you can do a health and privacy check. But go and look to see if these tools that you're using have these, because it's a great way to say, hey, let's get some fundamentals in place. Because it's, these organizations, they're selling these tools, like they don't want you to get hacked, because if you get hacked, maybe you'll stop paying them for the pleasure of the service that they have. And so they're trying to make it a little easier for people to get on board. When we do a Google Workspace assessment, we're checking something like 130 different items in the administrative panel to determine if it's set up in a secure way. And I think the last metrics we checked, like basically, let's see, the average amount of best practices of the organizations we assessed had in place were about 29%. So it's really rather low across. And it's not necessarily the fault of anyone, but when you buy these tools, they just come by default in a very insecure way so that you can do whatever you want with them.
Yeah. It's because the companies have to balance, like, if we make it too secure and then people are frustrated and don't use our product, they don't want that, right? So they kind of make it, like you're saying, not very secure, but then more usable, but then it leaves people open to attack. One thing that you all mentioned that I think surrounds some of this whole conversation, Steve, is around like privacy. Because I know, like, for example, on my team, we've talked about, like, hey, we shouldn't use... not even everyone on our team. Like, I use like the Brave browser instead of Google Chrome, and I try to clear my web history. But there's like, sometimes it feels a little bit like just like a fool's errand. Like you're rearranging, like, because there's so much data being like hoovered up by companies. And so could you just speak a little bit to like people who feel like, look, I know that people might feel like I'm not going to do that much to protect my privacy because I just feel overwhelmed. I don't feel like there's anything I can do. So yeah, how would you respond to people who might have that?
It's a great point, and it's something we hear from a lot of people. It's like, what all can we do? Because these services that people are signing up for and that are free, Facebook or Instagram or whatever, they're not really free. There's a real cost, and that cost is like all of your data. All of your data gets hoovered up, like you said, and analyzed and resold. And, it's the reason when you go and you move and you go to a new DMV is and you start getting all this junk mail. It's like, yeah, that DMV of your new state is selling your information to companies and you had no way to opt out. And so I think there's a few things that we like to encourage people to do is to look at those privacy health checks when they exist especially in the social media platforms. And for folks that have real concern about their privacy, there are these tools called data deletion services out there, which will...
So like Delete Me?
Exactly. Delete Me is a good example. There's a number of them out there. And the goal here is that you're giving Delete Me or whatever the data deletion service is permission to go and on your behalf request from all these companies called data brokers, which basically buy and sell huge amounts of private information about people. It's essentially sending them a request to delete your information from their databases. And it's really useful to do this because it lowers the amount of information that is available about a person on the internet. I mean, it's very simple to go and see based on a person's just with their name, like, okay, get their Facebook profile and look at their pictures and look to see where else on the internet they've used that picture and learn about what homes they've purchased or where they've rented and their criminal history. Like, it's very easy to get this information. And so the extent that you can use a sort of low barrier service like that to reduce that information that's out there, it really goes a long way to protect people from threats like doxing and some of these other physical threats that we see.
Garrett, you want to jump in? Anything on that?
Yeah, the fact of the matter is, as Steve was saying, we live in a surveillance and data economy. It's how so many things are powered nowadays. Your data is being constantly bought and sold out there on the internet. And it's not just governments that are doing surveillance. It is these commercial entities. It is these tech companies. It is data brokers that are spying on you as well. Just kind of going back to the threat modeling idea that I keep bringing up here is one of the recommendations that I would make under this. It is generally virtually impossible to evade all of this technical surveillance unless you are going to not use the internet, not use email, not use a cell phone, throw all that stuff in a lake, and you go live in a cabin in the woods somewhere. It is going to be virtually impossible to evade all of that. But what I would recommend is taking stock of, again, we talked about inventorying your accounts, your technology, your hardware, your software, but also your data and the types of things you communicate about, and determining what is the most sensitive data that you hold that you don't want someone else spying on or getting a copy of. And then thinking about the ways that you are communicating that data. Text messaging, regular old email, they're kind of just like sending a postcard through the mail. Anyone that picks that up and is moving it from one location to another can basically look at that data and read its contents, take a copy of it, sell it to someone else. And this is where we would recommend for those most sensitive organizations and that most sensitive data that your organization holds and communicates about, consider using some more secure alternatives for communicating that data. The Signal messaging app is one that Steve and I really, really like. It's an open source app. It's run by a nonprofit foundation. It is actively taking steps to minimize the amount of data that it's collecting on you, and it uses really strong end-to-end encryption so that not the Signal Foundation itself, not the cell phone carriers, nobody in between you and the person you're talking to can read or get a copy of any of the data that you're transmitting through that app. I'm not saying move all of your organization's communications to Signal because there's, management and data governance challenges with that as well. But at least for those conversations that are the most sensitive or dealing with the data that is the most sensitive data that your organization holds, consider moving those conversations from maybe open email or regular old text messaging to a more secure alternative like Signal.
Used by the highest levels of government, in fact.
Yeah, that was, yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, for what it's worth, Signal is not approved for classified communications, but the main reason for that is not because the encryption that Signal uses is weak. There is no adversary that I know of that could intercept the signals used by the Signal app and decrypt those communications. But where that data is at risk is on the endpoints, the mobile devices of the people having the conversation. That is where that data is unencrypted and available to view, and that is where they're having those conversations. And it is certainly likely that foreign intelligence services and other adversaries have interest in hacking those endpoints and hacking those mobile devices. So if a bad guy wanted to go after those very sensitive conversations being held over Signal, they're not going to intercept the signal in the middle. They're going to go try to hack that phone and get the data there.
And are you seeing that level, like actual nation state hacking of phones and things like that in your clients? Is that actually?
Yeah, so we're seeing a large number of organizations and organization types getting targeted on their mobile devices. I mean, journalists, certainly activists in that space, organizers are definitely top of mind. I mean, we see these commercial hacking tools that are out there. You may have heard of Pegasus. It's a spyware tool sold by an Israeli company. It's used even by the US government to conduct operations against foreign folks and domestic folks. It's a real threat, and it's a huge threat because people inherently trust a cell phone because it's like on them all the time. It's like in their pocket, it's next to them, it's always around you, and anything that's like that close, you just have a better sense of trust about. And
it feels very personal, very intimate.
Exactly. And so we find that people, they're just not protecting themselves and their use of these devices as carefully as they would say a computer, when it makes them more likely to fall victim. And so there are things we like to see people do with these mobile devices, like turn off your phone and turn it back on every day. It like sounds so dumb. It's like what the IT guy tells you to do is, just reboot the computer and like call me back if it's still broken. And it like, for sure, I know it sounds like that. But a lot of research has gone into the ability for these malicious apps and these attacks made by these companies targeting mobile devices, and that the software they install has a hard time surviving past turning a phone fully off and turning it back on again.
That seems like a fatal design flaw in the apps.
Yeah, for sure. But it speaks more to the structure of the operating system of the mobile device, right? Like it really is designed to manage the risk for these as much as possible, but there's always going to be some novel flaw found in WhatsApp or an iPhone or whatever that you're going to have. I did some work at a company that tested mobile apps that you got on your phone. And one thing we find is that just people have like dozens and dozens and dozens of apps installed on their device. I mean, even now, like I have to go through like pretty regularly every couple of weeks and be like, hey, like, do I really need this app anymore? And like, if I haven't looked at it or thought about it in 2 weeks, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to delete this. You see it, you're like on the subway, you like see people like scrolling through like 12, 15 pages of apps and you're like, for sure, you're not using all those. For sure, you're probably using 10 of those with any regularity. And the reason we encourage folks to delete apps they don't use is because apps can be subverted by malicious actors to collect data about the user. And even the ones that are free are taking information from your phone and selling it to data brokers.
Wow. Garrett, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, certainly. If you are in that category of people where you believe that governments are going to be using these multi-million-dollar capabilities, that the Pegasus tool that Steve was just talking about is a multi-million-dollar tool. If you are the type of person that a government is going to spend that kind of money on to try to get your information, there are some additional steps you can take to better protect yourself. As Steve said, rebooting your phone periodically or even daily if you're super high risk is something that will not make you completely immune from those sorts of attacks, but it'll make their lives harder. It'll make the attacker's life harder. It means they're probably going to get kicked off of your phone on a daily basis, so it might make it harder to do that sustained collection on your device. iOS and macOS also have a feature called lockdown mode, where you can turn this mode on, and it's going to restrict a lot of the functionality on your device, but it's going to shut down a lot of the avenues of exploitation that these types of advanced tools use to actually get the software exploit running on your device. And something else we just recommend, and this is also just good cyber hygiene, is install those updates, those app updates, and especially those operating system updates when they come out. Because very often, sometimes those updates add new features, but very often those updates are being issued to patch what are called zero-day exploits, which is Google or Apple has learned about a vulnerability in this operating system, and sometimes a vulnerability that they know bad guys or cyber actors out there are actively using to compromise these devices. So they're plugging those holes. They're making the update freely available to you. And I know it takes a little bit of time to update your phone, but it's like getting an immunization to a disease. When you update your phone, you are no longer vulnerable to that specific vulnerability or that specific exploit that some of these attackers might be using. So it's just staying ahead of the game, staying ahead of the pack. Don't be the slowest gazelle. Use good cyber hygiene, and the tier 1 nation state actors, if they want you bad enough,
they're going to get in.
They're probably going to get in, but you at least don't have to make it easy on them.
I just restarted my phone, so I probably just eliminated 4 different nation state actors off my device. Do you think, is it the same restarting computers every day? And then also, what do you think about people? I remember a few years ago, it was like people were like blocking their cameras, like, oh, I'm going to like block the CIA from like hacking my, like, what do you think about like that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Hacking a computer is generally a little bit easier than hacking a phone. That's just because mobile phones are designed to, as Steve was alluding to earlier, they really try to protect the core. They protect that core operating system, whereas you can get admin rights on your own computer, and you generally need those admin rights to install or remove software or install or remove a printer driver. Phones try really hard to never give you those admin rights, to never even give you the right to do harm to the core of the operating system. Computers, just because they're more flexible, we do more things with them. Generally, there's some way to grant that admin access, which means you can probably grant that admin access and access to the core operating system to a malicious application if you're not careful. With regards to covering the camera on your device, if you're an extremely privacy conscious individual, it's not a bad idea. Maybe, some laptops, some desktop webcams come with built-in shutters that you can shut to close that when it's not in use. But the vast majority of government agencies out there are not hacking random people's computers just to spy on them through their webcams. There's no intelligence value there. They don't really care. I always thought it was kind of silly that people would spend a lot of time, covering their webcams, but not do anything to disable the microphone in their computer, There's probably not going to be that much interesting information gleaned through that camera, but people say a lot of interesting things in the vicinity of their computers, So if I were a threat actor, I'm less interested in that camera than I am that microphone in that computer. And there are ways to disable that. You can disable microphones in software in your operating system interface, but that makes having Zoom calls difficult and complicated. That makes recording podcasts complicated. There are also physical hardware devices. There's what's called just an audio jack shunt, where it's basically if you took the 3.5 millimeter jack from a headphone.
I remember Snowden did a video about this where it's like,
clip that
don't
off,
use the phone mic. Yeah.
Yeah, that will generally fully disable internal microphones in a lot of laptop computers. Obviously, specifics vary, and it depends on the way the boards are laid out and everything else. But at least for me, I'm more concerned about microphones than cameras.
Steve, on this, I'm not sure if we have worked through the list of top recommendations. Anything else that we're missing from this sort of like easy wins column for folks?
Yeah, I think the thing we're trying to encourage people to do is to talk to the people in their orbit. Use the knowledge of your community to help you. And so in a lot of cases, that's talking to the folks that build your website or maintain your website about security. Like, just ask them, like, what are you doing to protect our website? And we often learn that the answer is nothing, right? Like, this is actually a pretty bad business move on the point of these companies building websites by not offering security services on top. So there's opportunity there. But very often we find an expectation by our purpose-driven partners that their website providers or their IT managed service providers they outsource, they're doing things to protect them that they're really not doing. And actually, this is like one of the biggest things that gets me all hot under the collar is like third parties sort of setting expectations willfully or not about the security practices that they're having, and that causes real risk to the organizations. And so when we do assessments for organizations, we're always asking about who are your third parties? Like, do you have a bookkeeper? Do they have access to Google Drive? Do they have access to your bank accounts? Do you have an IT provider? What do they have access to? And how do they approach security as a company? Because what we're trying to do is lower the risk of what we call a supply chain attack. And the thought there is like, okay, why would an attacker hack one nonprofit when they can go and hack an IT managed service provider that only works with nonprofits and use their access to that IT provider to access all of their nonprofit customers? And so it's not just you have to worry about in your organization. It's how do you talk about security with those folks that you're deeply embedded with and they have that access and you have that trust set up.
Garrett, you have more to say on that one?
Just kind of building that culture around security at your organization is something we always recommend. If you don't have one already, if you use Slack, make a security awareness channel in Slack where people can just highlight things they're wondering about. Like, hey, I saw this headline. Is this something that affects us? I got this strange email. Has anyone else gotten this weird email asking for information? And just by talking about it, you start to build that culture of security for your organization. And that's going to start to get people in that security mindset. It's going to make people start to be thinking twice before they just provide information to an email that comes through, before they click on a suspicious link or open a strange looking file that comes to them via email. And it also gives people a blame-free place to start to report strange things that happen in the organization. We always commend our partners that we work with when they make a mistake and they tell us about it quickly. Like, hey, I think I clicked on this email and it asked for my username and my password and I gave it, and then a thing popped up on my phone asking if I wanted to log in, and I said yes because I was logging in, but now I think that might have been bad. The sooner they report that to us, the sooner we can go and take a look and see if something was strange there. We worked an incident very recently where someone had inadvertently let an attacker into their organization, and because we got an alert and because they self-reported it very, very quickly, we were able to shut the attacker's access down before they were able to access a single thing in that organization. So being forthcoming, building that blame-free culture around security, and just getting people talking about it and thinking about it goes a long way in keeping your organization safe.
And I think a lot of this comes from the top, right? Like, encourage your leadership to share these sort of like these stories, right? They're going to have examples of, oh, we almost paid that fake invoice because the attacker was pretending to be me and try to get the CFO to approve the funds transfer. Or, hey, I clicked on this link and it led to this. And by leading by example and sharing, you show, hey, these attacks happen to everybody. It's not just like the people that are doing the programmatic work. They affect everybody. And it really normalizes it. I mean, we do phishing simulations for our partners, and
what's phishing for folks who maybe don't know?
Yeah, phishing is a type of email-based attack where an attacker will attempt to try to get you to download a malicious application or to solicit your username and password so they can attack your account.
Right. And it's not only like, hey, enter your username and password, but it can also be like, download this Word file, which also will be the same, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a popular format of attack for a lot of different kind of follow-on activities. And so we pose as these attackers and we launch these phishing simulations. And the organizations that we work with that have these Slack channels or Teams channels, we find that their rate of falling for this simulated phishing attack that we carry out to be drastically lower, like near zero. And we ran 2 tests last week against 2 different orgs. One org had a Slack channel for security, and I sent this phishing attack at like 12:45, and at 12:47, they sent me a screenshot of their Slack channel saying, "Hey, we just wanted to see if this was you doing this simulation." Someone posted this in the security channel, and like 45 people liked it, saying, "I saw this too." And that is like absolutely a way to win this game, right? Of this cat and mouse game. Like, we love to see that. Meanwhile, the other organization, none of that culture yet. Haven't had the chance to like really get into that with them. We have like, I don't know, we've got 25% of their employees.
Oh, wow. That's bad.
Yeah, to submit their Google Workspace credentials to us. And it just shows the power of this like security as a team sport approach.
In terms of, what do you recommend for just like phishing protection from companies who want to be better at that? Is it training, or is it like aware? Like, what do you, maybe Garrett, if you want to speak to that?
Yeah, certainly. So we recommend some sort of training program to get your employees used to spotting it. Most productivity suites, so Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace, do have built-in spam and phishing filters that will attempt to detect these sorts of emails. But, it's always an arms race. It's always a cat and mouse game. Google builds a new detection and attackers build a new obfuscation method to evade that detection. So most of these attacks are going to be caught by these filters in Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace, but you want to make sure that your employees are prepared to recognize these threats. Not if, but when they do evade the filters. Definitely treat emails coming in with a little bit of suspicion, especially if they're outside the organization, but also if they're coming from inside the organization too, because, your CFO's account might have been compromised. They might ask you to authorize a payment to a vendor you've never sent a payment to before. That's called business email compromise, which is kind of like a result of a phishing that's been successful against someone in your organization. So build that culture of, I don't like to say culture of suspicion, but let's say culture of security awareness around email that
Anyone's
are
coming.
Anyone's a threat. Yeah, we don't want people treating people inside the organizations like threat, but trust but verify, I guess, is the phrase they used to use in government all the time. But even beyond just the human awareness piece of it, these thresholds for detection are very often configurable in these interfaces. Microsoft 365 by default offers a baseline level of spam and phishing detection, but you can actually increase the sensitivity level of that a little bit from the standard preset to the strict preset. And then if you want to pay for a little more protection, you can pay for Defender for Office 365, which is going to give you a little bit more, machine learning powered detection on blocking these sorts of threats coming in. So you can definitely tune this a little bit. If you're finding that your current level of protection is inadequate, we always say, assess what you're doing first before you buy more tooling. You can implement some stricter security settings to begin, and then you can also start to pay for some additional protection features as well if you decide that's a good fit for your organization.
Walk me through, Steve, if a company is like, okay, we're going to hire RipRap to do, say, a Google Workspace assessment or something. Like, what does that process look like, just so people can visualize, okay, this is what they'd be looking at, and this is what we'd expect, kind of thing?
Yeah, so we typically knock these out in about a month. And what we start with is essentially a workshop where we try to understand how the organization is using Google Workspace. Certainly, we know that people use it for email and Google Docs and Sheets and stuff, but there are patterns and workflows and sort of cultural expectations about how organizations tend to use these tools that vary quite a lot across organizations. And so we try to get that picture so that when we're doing the assessment, we can say, hey, you're not doing this security best practice, but the trade-off of the security and the usability and the way that you're using the Google Workspace itself, it doesn't make a lot of sense to put that in place. So there's one setting, it's restrict the ability for anyone inside the organization to share their calendar details with anyone else in the organization. Ideally you turn it off and you wouldn't let anybody share anything, but people live and die by their calendars, right? You have to be able to do that. And so we try to take this usability assessment and get this context to apply to that assessment when we gain access, the customer provides us access to Google Workspace, and we conduct that assessment, and then we talk them through, hey, what are next steps? And for the recommendations that we have, like, what's the trade-off, right? Like, is it really worth jamming up people in the way that they're working in G Drive in this way, or can we propose an alternative way to manage the risks of that gap?
And so you're basically doing that assessment, talking to people, and then maybe auditing, like, here's the list of 130 things we recommend. How many of those things are you doing? And then there's like a report. Then there's a check, like, we're going to walk you through changing all these settings to basically get it correct.
Yeah. And we often find that the organizations they're missing some security protections, but we often find that they're not using the features as fully as they could, right? There's like a lot of features in Google Workspace that are not like big, sexy AI features, or they're not in Google Docs, or, they're just less well known, that go a long way in both in improving security and into making your life a lot easier, right? There's a capability called Google Groups that we really like for security and productivity and managing staff and access that basically no one uses. And it's a super powerful tool. So we look for opportunities to get a bit more out of these tools when we come across them.
Garrett, for you, what about I think a lot of companies probably have file sharing for like a bunch of PDFs, a bunch of random documents, like all set to like anyone on the web can access with just a link. What is the risk? Like, because you might say, well, not that many people have the link to this. There's only like 5 people. So it's pretty safe. But like, can you speak about what's the risk of having access to files of like anyone on the web type situation?
Yeah, that is what you highlight right there is honestly one of the most common cases of dangerous oversharing that we very often come across. That sharing of files to anyone with the link, what we generally try to tell people is you should only use that for files that you would be okay with if they printed that file on the front page of the New York Times, because once you publish that link or once you send it to one person, you no longer have any sort of control over who is able to access that file. You might be like, I only shared that link with one person, but that one person might have shared it to someone else. They might have accidentally posted it to an internal message board. Someone on that message board might have then taken that link and shared it with an external message board, and you lose any sort of audit or control capability over that file. So we really, really discourage that whenever possible. In fact, we recommend most organizations disable that if they at all can, just because the risk posed by that is really, really high. In Google Drive, for example, if an organization really truly does have a need to make files fully public to the entire internet, and there are certainly valid use cases for that, what we'll very often recommend is you set up a separate, it's in Google Workspace, it's called a shared drive, and you can set rules on a per drive basis and be like, hey, this is the public drive, this is the drive that is intended to be shared with the world, and we can set the rules up on that drive to specifically allow that type of open link sharing. You can do something similar in SharePoint for specific SharePoint sites on the Microsoft 365 side of things. But it is effectively that. It is that you just lose any visibility into who is accessing that file and any sort of control capability over that file, which is what makes that so dangerous.
Got it. Yeah, I think I've seen that in the Google, at least the share drive, like you can set up drives. And then so it would be like migrating your public facing document. Because like say you're like, hey, we want to share this free resource because it's actually like a lead generator or like something. And so you want it to be, but then putting it on a specific shared drive is probably a better practice because then,
Yeah, you can do that. Or if you host files on your website, you can share it there. Yeah. There's other ways to do that.
Yeah, we have a specific shared drive for presentations that we've presented at conferences that we make available, or templates that we provide free, but everything else is locked up tight in a series of other shared drives in the organization.
As we move towards wrapping, like what kind of time and energy investment, Steve, for you and your clients are, because some people might be like, oh my God, I don't have 100 hours to spend on this. But like, what are we realistically talking about to get from like pretty bad, just sort of like default practices to like not top tier lockdown security, but pretty good security? What have you seen?
Yeah. We run a cybersecurity foundations course, and the goal there is we want to help organizations put some foundations, some solid foundations in place, like mandated multi-factor and getting into good inventory and talking to your third parties. And we generally find that it takes organizations somewhere between 6 and 9 weeks if they set their mind to it. We give them, everything they need to be successful. But our thing is like, security is overwhelming for most people, right? It's like a thing you're worried about. It's a thing that a lot of people don't feel empowered to take action on. And so slow, consistent work is better than like rushing through, knocking out one and not thinking about security for the rest of the year. Like low and slow is like absolutely the way to win at security. And so we really take into account not just like an organization's ability to like buy tools or find a consultant. Certainly budget is a limiting factor, but like what is the cost of the organization in terms of their capacity to accommodate change? Essentially, how annoyed are people going to be as you start to put some of these protections in place? And can you drip them out over a longer period of time so they're just not so impactful all happening all at once?
Can you say more about the foundations course? Is that something that's a recurring training you all teach?
Yeah, we do it every quarter.
Is it a public-facing training?
Yeah, it's a public-facing training.
Okay.
Yeah, we open it for the public. We hold it about once a quarter. We hold 4 one-hour sessions across a 4-week period. And kind of the thesis was like, we want to help more organizations get started, right? Getting started is like the hardest thing to do with security very often. And so the way we try to structure it is like, let's teach you how to do things for security that you shouldn't have to pay someone like us to do, right? Get these things in place before you call us for more. And so what we try to do is we have the hour-long session, and then we provide all the checklists, the templates, the to-dos we've written for the multi-factor authentication. We've written like 6 weeks worth of Slack posts and emails and ways to engage your leadership. And the goal here is like, we're giving the attendees like everything that they need to do the thing as far as we can without us having to do the thing, right? Like they have to take it over the finish line, but we try to reduce the challenge and the barrier to entry for those things.
Maybe Garrett, what do you need right now and how can listeners help support your work? Maybe it's signing up for that course or that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It always helps us to hear about the challenges that people are facing with security. When it comes to us planning for the types of services we're going to offer, to be thinking about the threats that are facing these mission-driven organizations, it always helps when the communities and types of organizations that we work with are in open dialogue with us. Hey, this is something we're worried about. This is something we're thinking about. Do you have any recommendations for us? And we really like to build those relationships with communities and organizations over time. There's a lot of organizations that have never been clients of ours, but we're in touch with people at the organization because they have interesting information to share with us about certain threats they're facing or things that we're thinking about. And we're able to give them some advice or guidance, and it results in sort of a mutually beneficial relationship. And a lot of times we're like, yeah, we know we're not clients of yours yet, but, maybe down the road. And, in some cases that does happen. And if not, we're just happy to be making an impact at some of these organizations and these communities. And it feels good to be helping out. We also, as a B Corp, we are committed to providing at least 5% of our services pro bono. So even for the organizations that don't become our clients, we are able to help out in many cases.
Awesome. Steve, anything to add on what you might need right now for listeners to support your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think those conversations are what we really value. We have a newsletter that we write when we have something interesting to say, and we get a lot of great feedback from people about like, hey, I've always wondered about this, or hey, I'd like to share the story with you, or hey, we have this problem, how do we work through it? And the conversations we have drive what we put in that newsletter and the information that we share with people. So we'd love for you certainly to sign up for what we think is a useful newsletter, and then to have those conversations with us. Like, we love doing free consultations. We have no salespeople at the organization. We're just a couple of earnest cybersecurity nerds that want to help do-gooders do better in the world. And so we'd love any conversations to at least help point people in the right direction.
And then where can folks go to maybe sign up for the newsletter, learn more about you, any of your other sort of external resources folks might access?
Yeah. Our website is riprapsecurity.com. You can sign up for the newsletter there. You can learn about our grant program, which typically is in applications open up in the last quarter of each year for help the next year. And you find more information about the Foundations series as well for the training.
Great. Garrett, anything else to add before we wrap?
No, that's it. Thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for both for joining. It's definitely a personal interest of mine, and really appreciate you all making it easier for folks to sort of wrap their head around some of these security changes.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lift Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.